Sweat stung Cora's eyes as she strained against the broken wagon wheel. 7 months pregnant, widowed, and stranded on the unforgiving Wyoming trail, she knew the vultures were already circling. Then came the rumble of hooves. He was a mountain of a man in buckskin and grime, his eyes hard as flint. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't tip his hat. He just looked at the splintered wood, then at her swollen belly, and grunted. "Get in my wagon." Dust coated the back of Cora's throat, tasting of alkali and despair. She leaned heavily against the splintered side of her Conestoga, fighting the urge to vomit. The midday sun beat down on the Wyoming territory with a brutal, indifferent weight. It baked the sagebrush, it cracked the earth, and it threatened to cook the life right out of her. Her hands, blistered and wrapped in filthy rags, trembled as she touched her swollen abdomen. 7 months. The baby kicked, a sharp, frantic flutter that sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest. "Hush now," she rasped, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "We'll be all right." A lie. A desperate, pathetic lie. Her husband, Arthur, was buried 3 weeks back near Independence Rock. Cholera took him in 2 days. It stripped him of his dignity, then his life, leaving Cora with a half-empty wagon, a lame ox, and a belly full of a child who would never know its father. Now the axle was cracked right through. The left rear wheel listed at a sick angle, dug deep into the rutted trail. Cora grabbed the heavy iron jack, her muscles screaming in protest. She threw her weight against the lever. The wagon groaned. Wood shrieked against metal. The wheel didn't budge an inch. She tried again, gritting her teeth until she tasted blood, putting every ounce of her remaining strength into the effort. The iron lever slipped. Cora fell hard onto the unyielding dirt, crying out as a sharp pain shot up her side. She lay there for a long moment, staring up at the bleached blue sky. Vultures circled high above, tiny black specks riding the thermals. They were patient. Out here patience was usually rewarded. A low, rhythmic thudding pulled her attention back to earth. Hooves, heavy and slow. Cora scrambled to her feet, wiping the dirt from her face with a shaking hand. She reached into the wagon bed and pulled out Arthur's Navy Colt. It was heavy, too heavy for her clumsy grip, but she held it down by the folds of her skirt. Out here strangers weren't salvation. They were just another way to die. A massive draft horse crested the slight rise of the trail, pulling a battered, canvas-less supply wagon. The man driving it matched the beast in sheer size. He was draped in grease-stained buckskin and a heavy wool coat that made no sense in the sweltering heat. A thick, dark beard obscured most of his face, matted with dust and sweat. Across his lap lay a Sharps rifle, resting casually, yet ready. He pulled the reins, halting his horse a few yards from her crippled wagon. The silence stretched, broken only by the snorting of his horse and the wind whistling through the dry grass. Cora tightened her grip on the colt. She stood tall, squaring her shoulders, hoping the voluminous gingham dress hid the violent trembling in her knees. The mountain man didn't say a word. He surveyed the scene with eyes the color of bruised slate. He looked at the cracked axle. He looked at the lame ox panting weakly in the shade of the wagon. Finally, his gaze settled on Cora. His eyes dropped to her swollen belly, lingering for a fraction of a second before meeting her defiant stare. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the dusty trail. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever and climbed down. When his boots hit the ground, a cloud of dust puffed up around his ankles. He walked with a heavy, rolling gait, moving directly toward the rear of her wagon. "Stay back," Cora warned, her voice surprisingly steady. She raised the heavy pistol, pointing it squarely at his broad chest. The man stopped. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at her eyes. "You're holding that piece like it's a hot iron, ma'am," he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "Recoil on a .36 caliber will snap your wrist if you don't lock your elbow." Cora adjusted her grip, locking her arm. He grunted, a sound that might have been amusement. He turned his attention back to the wagon, stepping closer to the broken axle. He knelt in the dirt, completely ignoring the gun still pointed at him, and ran a massive, calloused hand over the splintered wood. "Oak," he muttered. "Dry, rotted from the inside. Ain't going nowhere. I can fix it," Cora said, the desperation bleeding through her tough facade. "I just need to get it jacked up." The man stood up, wiping the grease on his buckskins. He looked at her ox. "Beast is done. Got a bad limp? Dehydrated. You push it another mile, it'll drop dead in the traces." He wasn't cruel. He wasn't mocking her. He was simply stating facts, delivering them with the blunt force of a hammer. It was infuriating. "I didn't ask for your assessment, mister," Cora snapped, lowering the gun an inch. "I didn't ask for anything." "Didn't say you did." He walked past her, his massive shoulder brushing against hers. He smelled of wood smoke, old sweat, and pine resin. He went to his own wagon, reached into the back, and pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He walked back to her and tossed it at her feet. It landed with a heavy clinking sound. "What's this?" she asked. "Provisions, hardtack, jerky, couple canteens of water?" Cora stared at the sack, then back at him. "I don't have money to pay you." "Didn't ask for money." He walked over to her ox and began unhitching it from the ruined wagon. "What are you doing? Stop!" Cora stepped forward, raising the gun again. "Unhitching the animal so it can find shade before it cooks," he said without looking up. He slapped the ox's flank, sending it shambling toward the meager shadow of a nearby rocky outcropping. Then he turned and faced her. The wind whipped a strand of greasy dark hair across his eyes. He looked at the broken wagon, a symbol of all Arthur's failed dreams, and then at Cora, standing alone in the unforgiving wasteland with a baby kicking in her ribs. "Get in my wagon," he growled. The words hung in the oppressive heat. "Get in my wagon." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a chivalrous offer. It was a command, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who didn't expect to be argued with. Cora's grip on the Colt faltered, the heavy barrel dipping towards the dirt. "Excuse me?" "Your wagon is kindling," the man said, pointing a thick finger at the broken axle. "Your ox is finished. You stay here. You die. The kid dies. Get your essentials. Get in my wagon." Anger, hot and sudden, flared in Cora's chest. She was tired of being told what to do. Tired of men making decisions for her. Arthur had decided they should leave Missouri. Arthur had decided they should take the cutoff. And Arthur had died, leaving her to face the consequences alone. "I am not going anywhere with a stranger," she spat, her chin jutting out. "I will wait for the next train. There are people a few days behind us." The man stared at her, his expression unchanging. He reached into his coat and pulled out a battered pocket watch. He checked the time, snapped it shut, and put it away. "Nearest train is a week out, maybe more," he said, his voice flat. "Storm's coming over the Bighorns by tomorrow night. Temperature will drop 30 degrees. You got no shelter, no water. You'll freeze before you thirst to death. But it's your funeral." He turned his back on her and started walking toward his draft horse. Panic clawed at Cora's throat. He was right. She knew he was right. She had seen the dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, bruised and heavy. She looked at her broken wagon, a wooden tomb baking in the sun. "Wait," she called out. The word tasted like ash. He stopped but didn't turn around. "If I come with you, where are you heading?" "West," he said over his shoulder. "Fort Bridger, then up into the Wind Rivers." "I need to get to Oregon City. My sister is there." He finally turned, his slate-gray eyes meeting hers. Bridger is on the way. You can catch a train from there, assuming you live that long. It wasn't a comforting promise. It was barely a concession. But it was life. Cora lowered the gun completely, engaging the safety with a trembling thumb. She shoved it into the deep pocket of her apron. I need to get some things, she muttered, turning toward the back of her wagon. 5 minutes, he called out. And pack light. My horse ain't pulling a parlor room. Cora scrambled up into the sweltering interior of the Conestoga. It was an oven, suffocating and dark. All around her were the remnants of the life she and Arthur had packed away. The rocking chair her father had carved, the set of fine china Arthur's mother had gifted them for their wedding, the heavy oak trunk holding her winter quilts. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and angry. She couldn't take any of it. It was all just dead weight now. She grabbed a small canvas duffel bag. Into it, she shoved a change of clothes, Arthur's straight razor, a tin of matches, and a small leather-bound Bible. She hesitated over the rocking chair, her fingers tracing the smooth, curved wood. A violent kick in her ribs jolted her back to reality. She wasn't packing for memories. She was packing for survival. She grabbed her remaining food stores, half a sack of flour and a jar of pickled beans, and tossed them toward the tailgate. When she climbed down, the mountain man was waiting. He took the sack of flour from her hands without a word and tossed it into the back of his wagon. He grabbed her duffel and did the same. He stood by the front wheel, waiting. Cora walked over, feeling the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion dragging at her limbs. She looked up at the high wooden bench of his wagon. It seemed a mile in the air. She reached for the iron handhold, but her arms felt like lead. She tried to pull herself up, but her swollen belly threw off her center of gravity. She slipped, a gasp escaping her lips as she braced for the fall. Large, rough hands gripped her waist. The touch was entirely impersonal. It was like being grabbed by a pair of iron tongs. With a single, effortless heave, he lifted her off the ground and deposited her onto the wooden bench. Cora caught her breath, her face flushing crimson. "Thank you," she mumbled, staring at the floorboards. He didn't reply. He climbed up the other side, the wagon groaning under his weight, and took the reins. "Hollis," he said abruptly. Cora looked up, confused. "What?" "Name's Hollis. If you're going to ride on my bench, you ought to know what to call me when you want to complain." "Cora," she said, her spine stiffening. "Cora Miller. And I don't intend to complain, Mr. Hollis." "Just Hollis," he grunted. He flicked the reins. The massive draft horse threw its weight against the harness, and the wagon lurched forward. Cora grabbed the edge of the seat as they bumped over a deep rut. Every jolt sent a jarring ache through her lower back. She looked over her shoulder, watching her broken wagon recede into the distance, a small, sad monument to a ruined life. She turned back around, staring out at the endless expanse of sagebrush and jagged rock. Sitting next to Hollis was like sitting next to a boulder. He radiated heat and a quiet, imposing hostility. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't try to make small talk. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set. Cora wrapped her arms around her belly, feeling the rhythmic sway of the wagon. She was riding with a man who looked like he could kill a bear with his bare hands, heading into a storm, with nothing but a bag of clothes and Arthur's gun. It was a terrifying predicament. But as the afternoon wore on, and the brutal sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long purple shadows across the plains, Cora realized something strange. For the first time since Arthur died, she didn't feel completely alone. Wind hit the Wyoming plains like a runaway locomotive. It didn't arrive gradually. 1 minute the air was thick and stagnant, and the next, a wall of freezing air blasted across the sagebrush, carrying the metallic scent of impending rain. The sky bruised purple, then black, swallowing the late afternoon sun whole. Hollis didn't urge the massive draft horse faster. He maintained the same grueling, steady pace, reading the land with eyes accustomed to its hostility. He steered the wagon off the main rutted trail, guiding the beast toward a jagged spine of rock that rose from the prairie like the backbone of a buried monster. Cora huddled on the wooden bench. The sudden drop in temperature was violent. It bit through her thin dress, turning the sweat on her skin to ice. Her teeth chattered, a rapid, uncontrollable clicking that echoed loudly over the creak of the wagon wheels. She tried to muffle the sound by pressing her calloused hand over her mouth, but the shivering racked her entire body. Her back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, a reminder of the child weighing her down, draining her reserves. Hollis reached behind the seat without taking his eyes off the uneven ground. His massive hand rummaged blindly for a second before yanking free a heavy, hair-on buffalo hide. He dropped it onto her lap. It smelled of tallow, wood smoke, and old dirt. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She pulled it around her shoulders, burying her face in the coarse fur. The heat trapped within the heavy hide was instant and saving. She looked at the man beside her. He hadn't put on another layer. The wind whipped his greasy hair around his face, but he sat as immovable as an anvil, his massive hands holding the leather reins with casual strength. "Storm's breaking," he rumbled, his voice barely carrying over the rising howl of the wind. "Got about 20 minutes before the bottom drops out." "Can we outrun it?" she asked, her voice muffled by the fur. "You don't outrun weather out here. You dig in and pray it gets bored before you freeze." He guided the wagon into a deep, crescent-shaped depression carved into the side of the rock formation. It offered a natural windbreak on 3 sides. Before the wagon even rolled to a complete halt, Hollis was moving. He wrapped the reins around the brake and dropped to the ground. Cora watched him work. It was a masterclass in brutal efficiency. Every movement had a purpose, no wasted energy. He unhitched the draft horse, a beast he simply called Horse, and led it to the deepest part of the alcove, tying it off near a patch of sparse, dry buffalo grass. He pulled a heavy canvas tarp from the wagon bed, securing it over the exposed supplies with thick hemp rope, tying knots with swift, practiced jerks of his wrists. The first drops of rain fell. They were fat, heavy, and freezing cold, striking the dry dust like bullets. "Get down," Hollis commanded, suddenly at the side of the wagon. Cora moved to slide off the bench, but her stiff, freezing joints betrayed her. Her leg gave out, and she pitched forward. She braced for the hard impact of the ground, but it never came. Hollis caught her. He didn't just break her fall, he absorbed her entire weight against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like iron bands. He smelled fiercely of the wild: pine resin, horse sweat, and wet wool. For a split second, Cora froze, hyper-aware of his sheer physical power. He could crush her. He could leave her. Instead, he set her gently on her feet under the protective overhang of the rock face. "Stay out of the wind," he muttered, immediately turning his back to her. He moved back into the freezing rain, gathering dead sagebrush and splintered pieces of driftwood washed down from some ancient, dry riverbed. Within minutes, he had a fire going. He didn't use matches. He used a flint and steel, striking sparks into a nest of dry rabbit brush until a tiny ribbon of smoke curled upward, coaxing it into a roaring blaze with gentle, calculated breaths. Cora sank to the dirt floor of the alcove, pulling the buffalo robe tight. The fire pushed back the encroaching dark and the biting cold. Outside their small sanctuary, the storm unleashed its fury. Rain turned to sleet, rattling against the canvas tarp and the rock walls with deafening force. Hollis sat cross-legged across the fire from her. He pulled a heavy hunting knife from his belt and a piece of hardtack from his coat. He began shaving small pieces of the rock-hard bread into a tin cup, pouring water over it from a canteen and setting it near the coals to soften. He didn't look at her. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He simply kept the fire burning and prepared the meager ration. Cora watched the flames dance across his scarred, weathered face. Arthur would have been panicking right now. Arthur would have been cursing the sky, pacing the dirt, talking endlessly about how unfair it all was. Hollis just existed in the storm. He bent the hostile world to his needs and ignored the rest. A sharp, sudden kick against her ribs made her wince. She rested a hand on her belly. "When is it due?" Hollis asked. He hadn't looked up from the fire. Cora blinked, startled by the sound of his voice. 2 months, late October." He grunted. "Bad times to birth a child in the mountains. Snow's deep by then. Cold gets into the bones." "I didn't exactly plan the timing." She snapped, a flare of defensive anger piercing through her exhaustion. "Or the cholera, or the broken axle." Hollis finally raised his eyes. They were entirely devoid of pity. "Plan or don't. The winter doesn't care. The trail doesn't care. Out here, you adapt or you become fertilizer." He picked up the tin cup, the hardtack now a thick, unappetizing mush, and held it out to her. "Eat. You're feeding too, and you look like a stiff breeze would snap you in half." Smoke curled from the small fire, stinging her eyes, but Cora didn't move away. The heat was a lifeline. Outside the rock hollow, the Wyoming night was tearing itself apart. The wind shrieked like a wounded animal, driving sleet sideways across the plains. She took the tin cup from Hollis. His fingers brushed hers, rough, calloused, hot to the touch. She cradled the warm tin, staring down at the grey mush. Her stomach rolled, protesting the idea of food, but a deeper, primal instinct demanded sustenance. The baby needed it. She forced down a mouthful. It tasted of dirt and stale water, but it was warm. Hollis watched her eat for a moment before turning his attention to his rifle. He laid the heavy sharps across his lap and began wiping down the barrel with an oiled rag, his movements rhythmic and soothing. The firelight played across the intricate engravings on the receiver, catching the dull gleam of the steel. Silence stretched between them, heavy but no longer entirely hostile. It was the silence of two animals sheltering in the same den, bound by mutual survival rather than affection. Pain hit her low in the back. It wasn't the dull ache she had carried all day. This was a vicious, tightening band of agony that wrapped around her lower abdomen and seized her spine like a vice. Cora gasped, a sharp intake of air that hitched in her throat. She dropped the tin cup. It clattered against the stones, the remaining mush spilling onto the dirt. She doubled over, her hands clamping hard onto her swollen belly, her eyes squeezing shut. Hollis was across the fire in a fraction of a second. He moved with a terrifying speed that defied his massive frame. He didn't hover. He didn't ask if she was okay, a useless question on the frontier. He knelt beside her, his slate-gray eyes scanning her face, reading the lines of pain etched into her pale skin. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a low, steady rumble. Cora shook her head frantically. Panic clawed up her throat, suffocating her. "It's too early," she sobbed, the words tearing from her chest. "It's too early. Something is wrong." "Look at me." She opened her eyes. His face was inches from hers, blocking out the storm, the fire, the darkness. "Is it continuous or does it come and go?" he demanded, his tone entirely clinical. "It tightens, then it stops. Now it's hurting again, a sharp ache." She choked on a sob, terrified of the answer. Hollis didn't flinch. He pressed his massive, warm hand gently against the side of her belly, feeling the rigid tension of her muscles. He held it there for a long moment, his eyes focused on nothing as he counted the seconds in his head. "Your body's practicing," he finally said, pulling his hand back. "Braxton Hicks, women out at the forts get them all the time when they overwork. You carried a jack, fell in the dirt, and rode a hard bench for 6 hours. Your muscles are screaming, not the baby." Relief washed over Cora in a dizzying wave. She slumped back against the rock wall, pulling the buffalo robe up to her chin, her breathing jagged and shallow. "You're sure?" "I ain't a midwife," he grunted, moving back to his side of the fire. "But I've seen enough livestock drop early to know the signs of actual labor. You ain't there yet, but you keep pushing yourself. You will be." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch. He unlaced it and pinched out a handful of dried, crushed bark, tossing it into a small iron pot he nestled into the coals. "What's that?" Cora asked, her voice weak, the lingering adrenaline making her hands shake. "Willow bark, cramp bark, boiled down, tastes like a skunk's armpit, but it'll ease the muscles in your back and settle your stomach." He tended the pot in silence. The water hissed as it came to a boil, filling the small hollow with a sharp, medicinal scent. When it was ready, he used a thick piece of leather to lift the pot, pouring the dark liquid into his own metal canteen cup. He set it on a flat rock near her to cool. "Drink it when you can hold the metal without burning your skin," he instructed. Cora stared at the steaming cup, then up at the giant of a man sitting across from her. He was an enigma. A man who looked like he murdered men for their boots, yet he carried cramp bark and knew the signs of false labor. "Where did you learn all that?" she asked quietly. Hollis picked up his rifle again, resuming his cleaning. "Lived a long time, seen a lot of things die. You learn to recognize the ones that don't have to." It was a deflection, heavy with unspoken history. Cora didn't push. She watched the fire, the storm raging outside, feeling a little less terrifying. "Arthur, my husband," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was a clerk, a good man, gentle, but he didn't understand this place. He thought the West was just empty land waiting to be claimed. He didn't realize the land fights back." She looked down at her hands, the blisters raw and painful in the firelight. "He died screaming for water I couldn't give him. I buried him under a pile of rocks so the wolves wouldn't dig him up, and then I sat by that broken wagon, waiting to die too." She looked up, meeting Hollis's flinty gaze. "I'm not going to die out here. I'm going to make it to Oregon, with my child." Hollis stopped wiping the rifle. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. The flames cast deep shadows into the hollows of his face, making him look older, harder. "Oregon is 1,000 miles of bad water, hostile territory, and freezing mountains," he said softly. "I know." He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "Drink your tea, Cora. We ride at first light." Dawn bled across the horizon, a sickly yellow light piercing the heavy cloud cover. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world slick with freezing mud and battered sagebrush. Cora woke to the smell of strong, chicory-laced coffee and the sound of harness leather creaking. She pushed the heavy buffalo robe aside, her breath pluming white in the frigid air. Every joint in her body screamed in protest as she sat up. Her back throbbed, a dull hangover from the false labor of the night before, but the sharp, terrifying cramps were gone. Hollis was already working. He had hitched the massive draft horse to the wagon and was currently kicking dirt over the smoldering remains of their fire. He wore the same grease-stained buckskins, his thick coat collar turned up against the biting wind. "Coffee's in the pot," he said, not looking her way. "Drink it fast. We're losing daylight." Cora didn't argue. She carefully slid off the wagon bench, her boots sinking an inch into the freezing mud, and poured a tin cup of the black, scalding liquid. It tasted like burnt earth, but the heat radiating down her throat was intoxicating. She choked it down, grabbed her small bag of provisions, and climbed back onto the high wooden seat. They rode in silence. The trail was a ruined mess of deep, waterlogged ruts. The wagon pitched and rolled like a ship in a tempest, forcing Cora to brace her boots against the floorboards and grip the iron handhold until her knuckles turned white. Hollis drove with brutal focus. He didn't steer around the mud, he drove through it, trusting the raw horsepower of the beast pulling them. By midday, the faint, rushing sound of water reached them. Hollis pulled back on the reins, halting the wagon at the crest of a low ridge. Below them, a tributary of the Sweetwater River cut across the plains. Yesterday, it would have been a shallow, lazy creek. Today, swollen by the storm runoff, it was a churning, violent ribbon of brown water, carrying torn-up sagebrush and splintered branches in its frothing current. "We can't cross that," Cora whispered, her stomach dropping. "Have to," Hollis replied. He engaged the brake and jumped down into the mud. He walked to the water's edge, entirely ignoring the biting wind. He found a long, sturdy branch of deadwood and waded into the river. The water hit his knees, then his thighs. Cora watched in horrified fascination as the current tore at his legs. He jammed the stick down, testing the depth and the firmness of the riverbed, moving slowly across the 30-yard span. When the water crested his waist, he stopped, turned around, and waded back out. He was soaked. Freezing water dripped from his buckskins, his lips pressed into a tight, pale line. "Bottom's rocky, mostly solid," he grunted, unbuttoning his heavy wool coat and tossing it onto the wagon bench beside her. "Current is fast in the center. It's going to try to push the rear wheels downstream." "Hollis, you're freezing," Cora said, her voice tight with panic. "Let's wait. It will go down by tomorrow. We wait, the mud freezes solid tonight. We'll be locked into the ruts until a thaw. We cross now." He didn't give her time to argue. He grabbed the horse's bridle, intentionally staying in the freezing mud rather than climbing onto the dry bench. He was going to lead the beast by hand, using his own weight to keep the animal focused. "Grab the brake lever," he ordered. "When I yell, you release it. Don't touch it again unless I say so. You lock the wheels in that current, the water will flip us." Cora slid over, her small hands wrapping around the thick iron lever. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the churning water below. Hollis clicked his tongue. He stepped into the river, dragging the massive horse forward. The beast snorted, tossing its head, reluctant to step into the freezing torrent. Hollis didn't yell. He didn't strike the animal. He simply leaned his entire weight against the leather straps, a silent, immovable force of will. The horse yielded, stepping into the foam. "Brake!" Hollis roared over the rushing water. Cora threw her weight forward, releasing the iron lever. The wagon groaned and rolled down the muddy bank, plunging into the river with a violent splash. Ice-cold water sprayed over the floorboards, soaking Cora's boots and the hem of her heavy skirt. The wagon bucked as the front wheels hit the rocky bottom. The current was instantaneous and brutal. It slammed into the side of the wooden box, shoving it sideways. Cora screamed as the wagon listed sharply to the left. "Hold on!" Hollis bellowed. He was waist-deep, fighting the current with his own body, keeping the horse's head turned upstream. The beast was panicking, its massive hooves slipping on the submerged rocks. The rear of the wagon began to swing downstream. The wood shrieked. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, clinging to the wooden bench, waiting for the inevitable tipping point, waiting to be plunged into the freezing dark. "Pull!" Hollis screamed, slapping the horse's wet neck. The animal surged. Muscle and bone strained against the harness. The wagon lurched, the front wheels catching a solid ridge of stone. With a violent heave, the horse dragged the heavy carriage out of the deepest part of the channel. The water dropped from the floorboards. Seconds later, the front wheels hit the muddy opposite bank. The draft horse dug in, its hooves churning the earth, and hauled the wagon up onto solid ground. They stopped. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the horse and the roar of the river behind them. Cora opened her eyes. Her hands were locked onto the iron bar so tightly her fingers were numb. She looked down. Hollis was leaning against the front wheel. He was drenched, shivering violently, his skin taking on a dangerous, bluish pallor in the freezing wind. She didn't think. She grabbed the heavy buffalo robe from the bench, scrambled down from the wagon, and threw it over his massive, soaking shoulders. Hollis flinched at the sudden contact, his slate-grey eyes snapping to hers. They were wild for a fraction of a second, the eyes of a cornered predator before the recognition settled in. He pulled the thick hide tight around his chest, his jaw clamped shut to stop his teeth from chattering. "Get back in the wagon," he rasped, his voice barely a croak. "You need to get out of those wet clothes!" She demanded, her fear replaced by a sudden, fierce, maternal instinct. "You'll die of exposure. Ain't dead yet." He muttered. He hauled himself up onto the bench, the wagon groaning under his weight. He didn't look back at the river. He just flicked the reins. "We ride until we find dry wood." Mud clung to the wagon wheels like heavy grey cement, slowing their progress to a grueling crawl. 3 days after crossing the swollen river, the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range finally began to dominate the western skyline. Between them and the mountains lay a desolate stretch of scrubland, broken only by a small, miserable smudge of civilization. It wasn't a town, it was barely an outpost. 2 sod-roofed buildings huddled together against the wind, surrounded by a dilapidated corral and a smattering of canvas tents. A faded wooden sign, hanging by a single rusted nail, read, "Miller's Crossing." Hollis pulled the wagon to a halt near the corral. He looked worse for wear. The river crossing had taken a toll, a deep, rattling cough had settled into his chest, and his eyes were bloodshot from the relentless wind and lack of sleep. "Need axle grease," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "And oats for the horse. Stay on the bench. Keep the colt in your lap." Cora nodded, pulling her heavy wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers wrapping around the familiar, heavy grips of Arthur's revolver. She rested it under the fabric on her lap, out of sight but ready. Hollis climbed down, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt with a heavy thud. He walked toward the larger of the 2 sod buildings, his massive frame radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. The door creaked open, spilling the sour smell of unwashed bodies and bad whiskey into the cold air, before snapping shut behind him. Cora sat in silence, watching the outpost. It was a bleak place. A few emaciated horses stood in the muddy corral, their heads hanging low. 2 men sat on overturned crates near the canvas tents. They looked like the land itself, hard, dirty, and utterly unforgiving. One of them, a gaunt man with a patchy beard and a filthy bowler hat, noticed the wagon. He nudged his companion. They both stood up, their eyes fixing on Cora. She stiffened. The instinct to hide was overwhelming, but she forced herself to sit tall. She was a widow, 7 months pregnant, sitting alone on a wagon full of supplies in a place where men killed each other for a pair of intact boots. The gaunt man started walking toward her. His companion, a broader, heavily scarred man wearing a tattered Confederate cavalry coat, followed a few paces behind. "Well now," the gaunt man called out, stopping a few feet from the front wheel. His voice was slick, like oil on water. "That's a mighty fine rig for a lady to be driving all by her lonesome." "I am not alone," Cora said. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her fear, and she hated herself for it. The man smiled, revealing a row of rotting, blackened teeth. He stepped closer, resting a dirty hand on the side of the wagon box. "Husband inside, is he? Buying you something pretty? Maybe he needs some help carrying it out. We're neighborly folks around here." He leaned in, his eyes dropping to her swollen belly. The crude, invasive stare made Cora's skin crawl. "Take your hand off the wagon," she ordered. She slipped her thumb under the fabric of her shawl, finding the hammer of the colt, and pulling it back with a sharp, metallic click. The sound was loud in the quiet air. The gaunt man froze, his oily smile faltering. The scarred man behind him casually let his hand drift toward the heavy revolver on his hip. "Now there ain't no need for that kind of hostility, ma'am," the gaunt man said, holding his empty hands up in a mocking gesture of surrender. "We was just making conversation. Seeing a woman in your condition out here, it makes a man worry. Worry about yourselves." The sod building's door kicked open with a violent crash. Hollis stepped out. He didn't have a sack of oats or a tin of grease. He had nothing in his hands, but the air around the wagon instantly shifted, growing suffocatingly dense. He didn't run. He walked. It was the slow, deliberate stalk of a grizzly bear that had just found wolves near its kill. His slate-grey eyes were locked on the gaunt man leaning against the wagon. The two drifters turned. The gaunt man's mocking smile vanished entirely. The scarred man took a half-step backward, his hand hovering over his gun, unsure. Hollis didn't say a word. He reached the gaunt man, grabbed him by the throat of his filthy shirt, and hoisted him off the ground. The man let out a strangled gasp, his boots kicking uselessly in the air. Hollis didn't punch him. He simply pivoted and threw the man backward with terrifying force. The drifter crashed into the freezing mud 10 feet away, rolling over twice before coming to a stop, gasping for air. The scarred man panicked. He drew his gun, clearing leather with surprising speed. Hollis didn't flinch. Before the man could level his barrel, Hollis stepped inside his guard. His massive hand clamped down over the cylinder of the drifter's revolver, stopping it from rotating. With his other hand, he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted violently. Bones snapped loudly. The man screamed, dropping the gun into the mud. Hollis shoved him backward, sending him crashing into his gasping companion. "Get on your horses!" Hollis grunted, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Ride south. If I see either of you on the trail, I won't use my hands." The two men didn't hesitate. The scarred man clutched his broken wrist, his face pale with shock. They scrambled out of the mud, stumbling toward the corral without looking back. Hollis watched them go. Then he bent down, picked up the drifter's discarded revolver from the mud, and tossed it casually into the back of his wagon. He climbed up onto the wooden bench beside Cora. He smelled of sweat, stale air from the trading post, and raw violence. He took the reins in his massive hands, his face completely devoid of expression. "You cocked the hammer, but you didn't raise the barrel," he said quietly, flicking the reins. The wagon lurched forward. "Next time, you point it at his chest. If you're going to threaten a man, let him look down the hole." Cora stared at his profile, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified of the brutal world they were driving through. But looking at the mountain of a man sitting beside her, she realized something even more terrifying. She was beginning to trust him. Elevation changed the air. It grew thinner, scraping the back of Cora's throat with every breath. They were climbing into the foothills of the Wind Rivers now. Sagebrush surrendered to twisted, wind-battered junipers, and the dirt trail gave way to unforgiving granite. Hollis hadn't spoken since the outpost. He drove with a mechanical, grim focus. But the river was exacting its toll. A violent cough racked his massive chest. It wasn't a dry, dusty rattle. It sounded wet. Deep. He doubled over the reins, his broad shoulders heaving, coughing until he gasped for thin air. When he finally sat back up, his face was flushed, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, slick with unnatural sweat despite the freezing wind. Cora watched him, her grip tightening on the heavy wool shawl. "You're burning up." "Just a chill," he rasped. His voice sounded like tearing canvas. "It's not a chill. It's the fever." He didn't argue. He just kept his eyes on the narrow, rocky incline ahead. But his hands, normally steady as carved stone, were trembling. The heavy draft horse sensed the weakness. The beast slowed, its hooves slipping on loose shale, waiting for the firm command that didn't come. The wagon lurched backward an inch. Hollis gritted his teeth and tried to pull the leather straps, but his arms lacked their usual terrifying strength. He coughed again, a sickening, hollow sound, and slumped forward. The reins slipped from his fingers, dragging in the dirt near the horse's hind legs. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Cora's chest. If the wagon rolled backward down the incline, it would shatter. She didn't ask permission. She lunged across the wooden bench, her pregnant belly pressing uncomfortably against the edge, and snatched the reins just before they fell out of reach. She pulled hard, wrapping the thick leather around her blistered hands. "Walk on!" she yelled, her voice cracking. The horse pinned its ears back, confused by the sudden change in command. It threw its massive head. "Walk!" Cora screamed, slapping the leather against the animal's broad rump. The horse surged forward, digging its iron shoes into the granite. The wagon groaned, rolling up and over the steep lip of the incline, finally leveling out onto a narrow plateau shadowed by towering pines. Cora threw her weight against the iron brake lever, locking the wheels with a loud screech. She dropped the reins and turned to Hollis. He was leaning heavily against the sideboard, his eyes closed. His breathing was rapid and shallow. "Hollis!" She reached out, pressing the back of her hand against his forehead. He was radiating heat like a cast-iron stove. He flinched at her touch, his eyes fluttering open. The slate-grey intensity was gone, replaced by a glassy, unfocused haze. "Need to keep moving," he mumbled, trying to push himself upright. His arm gave out, and he collapsed back against the wood. "We aren't going anywhere," Cora said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You can't drive, and I can't drive this beast through these mountains." "Exposed up here," he muttered, coughing weakly into his fist. "Wind'll cut us to ribbons tonight. There's a line shack, trapper's cabin, couple miles up." He closed his eyes again. He was fading. The giant who had tossed a man like a rag doll was being hollowed out by a river chill. Cora looked at the towering, jagged peaks ahead. The sky was already deepening into a bruised twilight. She was exhausted. Her back ached with a dull, constant throb, and the baby was restless, kicking sharply against her ribs. She wanted to curl up under the buffalo robe and weep. Instead, she picked up the reins. She looked at the massive horse. "You listen to me," she warned the animal. "I don't have his strength. But if you pitch us off this mountain, you go down too." She released the brake. The next 2 hours were a waking nightmare. Cora drove. Her arms screamed with the effort of holding the heavy beast steady on the treacherous trail. The wagon jolted over boulders and dipped into freezing streams. Every violent sway threatened to throw Hollis from the bench. She had to wedge her knee against his thigh, using her own body weight to keep him upright, while fighting the leather straps with bleeding hands. Darkness fell hard. The wind picked up, howling through the pines, carrying the bitter promise of snow. Just as Cora's arms were about to give out entirely, the trail widened. Tucked into a dense grove of spruce, partially shielded by a massive rock face, sat a squat, decaying log structure. Its roof sagged, and the door hung off a single leather hinge. It wasn't salvation, but it was walls. She hauled back on the reins, dragging the wagon to a halt near the entrance. She locked the brake and slumped over, gasping for breath. She had made it. But looking over at Hollis, unconscious and shivering violently in the freezing dark, she knew the hardest part was just beginning. She had to get a 250-pound man off a high wagon bench and into a ruined cabin, alone. Shadows stretched long and violet across the snow-dusted timberline. Cora climbed down from the wagon, her legs trembling so violently she nearly collapsed into the freezing mud. She leaned against the front wheel, forcing her lungs to expand, pushing past the exhaustion. She walked to the passenger side. Hollis was slumped over, a dead weight against the wooden rail. "Hollis," she said, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, a raw animal sound, but his eyes remained shut. Cora gripped his heavy wool coat and pulled. He didn't budge. He was completely unresponsive, anchored by his sheer mass. She climbed onto the hub of the wheel, reached around his broad chest, and hauled backward with everything she had. He tipped. They tumbled off the wagon together. Cora twisted mid-air, taking the brunt of the fall on her shoulder in the dirt to protect her belly. Hollis crashed down heavily beside her, his head lolling in the frost-heaved mud. Pain flared blindingly up Cora's arm. She bit back a scream, tasting copper. "Get up!" She gasped, rolling onto her knees. She grabbed his lapels. "Hollis, you have to help me, I can't drag you." His eyelids fluttered. He managed to plant one massive hand in the dirt, trying to push up, but his elbow buckled. Cora wedged herself under his armpit. She planted her boots, gritted her teeth against the throbbing in her lower back, and heaved. Slowly, agonizingly, they rose. He leaned most of his weight on her, crushing her shoulder, his feet dragging through the mud as she guided him toward the sagging doorway of the line shack. Inside, it smelled of rot and old wood smoke. Half the roof was gone, letting in a patch of starry, freezing sky. But the back corner, near a crumbling stone hearth, was dry. Cora guided him to the floor. He collapsed instantly, curling onto his side, coughing until he choked. She didn't stop to rest. Survival was a ticking clock. She ran back out into the biting wind, unhitched the draft horse with clumsy, freezing fingers, and led it into the shelter of the pines, tying it off where the wind couldn't cut as deep. She dragged the buffalo robe, her small duffel, and his canvas sack of provisions into the cabin. Wood. She needed wood. She scoured the floor of the shack in the dark, finding a pile of dry, brittle pine branches some past trapper had left behind. She piled them into the hearth. Her hands shook so badly she struck 3 matches before one finally flared. She held it to a tuft of dry moss, blowing gently until a meager orange flame bit into the wood. Light pushed back the shadows. The cabin was a ruin, but the fire was life. Cora knelt beside Hollis. His clothes were still damp from the river, frozen stiff in places. "I have to take your coat off," she told him. She didn't wait for a response. She unbuttoned the heavy wool, struggling to peel it off his massive, uncooperative shoulders. Underneath, his buckskin shirt was soaked in fever sweat. She draped the heavy buffalo robe over him, tucking the coarse fur around his neck. He shivered, a violent, full-bodied tremor that made his teeth click loudly. "Cold," he mumbled, turning his face toward the fire. "I know." Cora sat down next to him. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible to conserve heat, and wrapped her shawl tight. The baby kicked, a slow, rolling movement that felt heavy and tired. "We're okay," she whispered, resting a hand on her belly. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Hours bled away. The wind tore at the ruined roof, dumping flurries of snow through the gaps, but the corner near the hearth remained somewhat warm. Cora fed the fire piece by piece, terrified of running out of wood before dawn. Sometime past midnight, Hollis stopped shivering. His breathing changed. The wet rattle deepened, but the frantic, shallow gasps leveled out. Cora touched his forehead. He was still hot, but the terrifying, oven-like heat had broken slightly. He shifted under the buffalo robe, his eyes opening. They were lucid, bloodshot and exhausted but clear. He looked at the crumbling stone hearth, the ruined roof, and finally at Cora, sitting huddled near his boots. "You drove," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You passed out." He stared at her. "You dragged me in here? You fell." She corrected softly. "I just aimed you at the door." A small, rough sound escaped his chest. It took Cora a moment to realize it was a laugh. He winced, the laugh turning into a painful cough, but he held her gaze. Arthur was a fool, Hollis murmured, the gravelly edge returning to his voice. Cora stiffened. Don't speak ill of the dead. Ain't speaking ill, just stating facts. He closed his eyes, turning his head back toward the fire. He brought a lioness out to the plains, thinking she was a house cat. You ain't meant for parlors, Cora. You're meant for this. The words hung in the smoky air, heavy and raw. Cora stared at the massive, broken man lying on the dirt floor. He wasn't complimenting her. He was recognizing her. Out here, where the world stripped away everything soft and polite, he saw exactly what she was. A survivor. She didn't reply. She just placed another piece of wood on the fire and kept watch. Sunlight pierced the ruined roof of the line shack, sharp and pale. Cora woke with a stiff neck and a mouth tasting of ash. The fire had burned down to grey embers, offering nothing but a faint memory of heat. Beside her, Hollis was already awake. He was sitting upright, leaning his broad back against the rotting logs. He looked hollowed out, his skin ashen, but the terrifying, oven-like heat radiating from his body had vanished. You let the fire die, he observed, his voice a dry rasp. You stopped shivering. Wood was low. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her aching lower back. The baby was quiet, resting heavy in her pelvis. He grunted, pushing himself off the dirt floor. It took him 2 tries. The raw power that usually propelled him was entirely gone, leaving behind a battered, mortal man. He didn't ask for help, and Cora didn't offer it. Some prides were too fragile to touch. He walked to the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, looking out at the snow-dusted pines. Storm's past. Trail's going to be a slick mess of ice and mud, but it's a steady downgrade to the valley. Can you drive? Cora asked. She stood up, shaking the freezing dirt from her heavy skirt. Reckon I have to, unless you plan on throwing me in the back with the flour. They hitched the draft horse in silence. The beast looked as exhausted as they felt, its thick coat matted with frozen mud. Hollis moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, checking the leather traces twice with numb fingers. When he finally hauled himself onto the wooden bench, a bead of sweat rolled down his pale temple despite the freezing air. Cora took her place beside him. She didn't hand him the reins immediately. She held the thick leather straps in her lap, looking at his bruised, trembling hands. If you pass out again on a downgrade, we'll roll over and die, she said plainly. I won't pass out. You don't get to promise that. I'm driving. Hollis slowly turned his head. His slate-grey eyes studied her face. He didn't see the frightened, desperate widow he had found stranded in the alkali dust days ago. He saw the woman who had hauled him out of the mud, fought off scavengers, and kept the fire burning in the dark. He gave a single, short nod. He leaned back against the wooden rail, folding his thick arms across his chest. Cora flicked the reins. The wagon groaned, rolling forward onto the treacherous, ice-slicked trail. The descent was terrifying. The heavy wagon pushed hard against the horse, forcing the animal to brace its hind legs and slide through the freezing mud. Cora drove with her teeth clamped shut, her arms burning as she fought the iron brake lever. Beside her, Hollis offered quiet, sparse corrections. Cut left. Keep the wheels out of that rut. Ice is too thick. It'll snap the axle. Cora pulled the left rein, her muscles screaming. The wagon groaned, slipping sideways before catching traction on exposed rock. She exhaled a shaky breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Ease off the brake. Let the horse find its footing, he murmured. You're doing fine. They worked as a single unit. The mountain man and the widow, communicating in grunts and short commands, navigating the brutal landscape. As morning bled into afternoon, the jagged granite peaks began to give way to rolling hills of golden, winter-cured grass. The air warmed fractionally, carrying the scent of damp earth and crushed sage. Below them, cradled in a wide valley, a thin ribbon of smoke drifted into the clear blue sky. Fort Bridger. Cora pulled back on the reins, halting the wagon on the final ridge. She stared down at the distant cluster of timber buildings and canvas tents. It was civilization. It was safety. A strange, heavy knot formed in her throat. She had survived. She had protected her child. But looking down at the fort, she realized what it actually meant. Next train out to Oregon City should be passing through in a week or two, Hollis said quietly. He was staring at the smoke, his expression unreadable. You can buy a secure spot in a good wagon. Find a family to travel with. Safe. Cora looked down at her blistered, bruised hands gripping the leather reins. She thought about a safe wagon. She thought about polite conversation, shared meals, and people who didn't know the terrifying cruelty of the plains. She thought about arriving in Oregon, a poor widow dependent on her sister's charity. I'm not getting on another train, Cora said. The words slipped out before she had fully processed them, but once spoken, they felt like iron. Hollis slowly turned his head. Oregon is 1,000 miles. I know. You can't make it alone. I didn't say I was going alone. She finally looked at him. He was battered, covered in grime, smelling of fever sweat and wood smoke. He was the hardest man she had ever met. But he was also the man who carried cramp bark for a pregnant stranger, who risked drowning to get her across a freezing river, and who saw her as a lioness rather than a burden. Hollis met her gaze. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken things. He didn't offer a romantic declaration. He didn't make promises about the future. He just looked at her, understanding exactly what she was asking and exactly what it would cost him. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand covering her small, blistered fingers resting on the reins. His grip was warm and steady. Wind rivers are decent this time of year, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. Got a cabin up near the snowline. Solid roof. Good stove. Cora felt a sudden, fierce tear burn the corner of her eye. She blinked it away, keeping her chin high. Is there room for a crib? A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth beneath the thick beard. Reckon I can build one. He took the reins from her hands. He didn't yell at the horse. He just gave a quiet click of his tongue, and the wagon rolled forward down the ridge. They didn't head for the fort. They skirted the edge of the settlement, pointing the heavy wooden wheels north, toward the deep timber and the high peaks. The frontier was vast, brutal, and entirely unforgiving. But as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plains, Cora rested a hand on her belly and leaned back against the wooden bench. For the first time in months, she was exactly where she belonged. And that concludes the gritty journey of Cora and Hollis. What started as a desperate fight for survival on the unforgiving Wyoming Trail turned into an unexpected partnership between a cynical mountain man and a fierce widow who refused to give up. If you enjoyed this deeply human story of resilience and frontier romance, please hit that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow story lovers and subscribe so you never miss our next adventure. Let me know in the comments. What kind of life do you think awaits them in the high timber? Thanks for listening.